Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's playing conditions calculation webinar. My name is Jason Funderburg. I'm going to be moderating and asking your guys questions. Just a quick note on that, there is a pane in the drop-down of the GoToWebinar that has a questions app. Just double click that, open it up, and ask any questions that you do have. We will have designated stop areas for questions, so just ask them whenever they come to mind. Joining me today is Steve Latos, Mario Mackey, and John Manos of the Member Services Department. Steve is actually going to be presenting today's webinar. And before I pass it over to him, just a few things to go over. Today's webinar is going to be recorded. All of the webinars that we have will be posted at gapgolf.org/gap-webinars. Those will be available within a few hours after the presentation. So now I'm going to kick it over to Steve. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Jason, and sorry for the issues there. So again, what we were saying was there were 3 systems across the world that were already using some form of adjusting whole score or total scores at the end of the day. Those were from Kongu, the European Golf Association, and Golf Australia. So it was a collaboration from what worked for them, what didn't work, trying to get those bugs removed, as well as the data that the USGA had. One thing that we definitely borrowed from each of those associations throughout the world was the 3-letter acronym. Obviously wanted to keep that as PCC. Jason, you can unmute everyone to laugh at that horrible joke. So a couple common questions on the playing conditions calculation. We will answer all of these throughout the presentation, and we will also stop throughout for questions. But if one of these was your questions, we will answer it during the presentation. So probably the most common one is who applies to PCC? Is it done automatically? Does the course do it? Does staff do it? What about the clubs that have staff that are overwhelmed with work already? Is this one more thing that they have to do? Will I know when PCC has occurred? How will it appear on the scoring record? And then what about situations where the weather is windy and raining in the morning but clears up in the afternoon? How does PCC address those situations? And then the 2 on the right-hand side deal with kind of the data that we get. Will PCC extend the score posting season in the GAP region? And ultimately, do you foresee the possibility of actual score data replacing the rating process to determine scratch and bogey ratings? So we will answer all those throughout the seminar. So basically, the basis of playing conditions calculation and looking at expected scores is the concept of target score. So target score is calculated as par plus course handicap. That course handicap calculation is important because it's calculated using the course rating and slope. So the rating and slope that our team goes out and rates each course for, that's a foundation for establishing target score, which is a basis for the playing conditions calculation. So we take a look at an example. A player has an index of 11.1. They play a course with a rating of 71.3, slope of 123, and par of 71. That equates to a course handicap of 12. We do have a webinar on Friday of this week that'll address exactly how course handicap is calculated in the New World Handicap System, but it comes out to 12 in this example. We add par back to that. The player's target score is 83. Important to note, a player will only shoot their target score about 1 in every 5 rounds. That's because the handicap index takes 8 out of the best 20 scores in the last most recent 20 rounds. So it's a little tilted towards better scores. It's not a raw average. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. We'll see that come into place in a couple times. But with target score, it can be calculated for any player that plays a golf course on a given day. So that means member or guest, male or female, someone that plays all the way back on the championship tee or all the way forward on family tee. So when we're looking at PCC and target scores and expected scores, anyone that plays the course will be considered. One caveat for that is only players with a handicap index of 36.0 or below will be considered under the PCC calculation. The reason for that is the higher you get with handicap index, the more natural variation there is, and it's harder to predict what a player will shoot on a given day. So using that target score, we take a look at this graph here on the left-hand side of the screen. The blue dots are representing what the target score would be for every player that played the course that day. It will always be a linear line because as your course handicap goes up by 1, the target score will go up by 1. So just looking at it, a player with a with a course handicap of 0 has a target score of 72, and hypothetically on this day, their actual score was 82. So if actual scores, which are those scores in orange, deviate significantly from the target scores, which again are in blue, the PCC will automatically be applied. This means the golf staff at the club will not have to record weather information or course setup information. They can only do that, they can always do that for their own housekeeping. For example, if they notice that they put the pins in spot 2 on the course, that there's always a PCC, maybe they say, hey, we shouldn't have that combination of hole locations, or whenever the wind's 15, 20 miles an hour, a PCC is applied, things like that. But they will never have to put in that information. It's only for their own good. It won't ever be recorded in this system. So it is calculated only once per day, and that's at midnight local time. The reason for that one calculation is there's a lot of gray area that comes into play if you're doing multiple calculations in a day. So let's say the weather was good in the morning and at 1 o'clock it turned nasty. Where exactly would that cutoff point be if you were going to do 2 PCCs? Of people that teed off at 11:30 that played an hour and a half in the good weather and then 2.5 in the bad weather, would they be on the bad side, even though that's only about 60%? That brings in a lot of variation, a lot of manual work when the club would have to say, here's where it turned bad, etc. We want to make this as easy for the club to implement as possible and as objective as possible. If we add in picking out when the weather turned bad, that would be a subjective manual calculation. We want to avoid both of those things in the new world handicap system. And lastly, 8 eligible scores are required to fulfill sample size requirements, so PCC will only take effect if there are 8 scores on a course on a given day. Again, this can be any combination of member, guest, male, female from any tee, but 8 are required. So we'll stop now for any questions. Jason, did anything come through?
Not currently. I'm sure some will start flowing in now that we've stopped for a second. But I would say let's, okay, here's a good one. Is it 8 random or the first 8 scores that's going to be used?
So it's just a minimum of 8. All scores will be used given, assuming that the handicap index is 36.0 or below. So it's just a minimum of 8, but all scores will be used. So if 200 scores were submitted on a course, all 200 will be used that day.
Perfect. All right, let's keep moving here. Actually, I got one more, sorry. How is the PCC represented? What does a +1 mean?
So we will answer that question going forward. Great question. It will come in the next couple slides.
And one more quick one. How do guests record their score?
So guests can record their score in any method. We did have a How Do I Post My Score webinar last Friday that Mario went through. So you can use gin.com, you can use the Gin mobile app, you can use the Gap Locker to post scores. Any score posting method, as long as you select the correct course, that will be reflected and included in the PCC calculation.
All right, one more question before we move on, and a quick note to everyone, just so you guys know, Mario actually posted that video link from earlier in the chat portion of the interface for GoToWebinar, so if you want to follow that link at any time to watch that video, you are free to. Real quick, Steve, for you, will the PCC be put in for the whole region?
Yeah, so basically every single course in Gap and every single course in the world will have PCC applied to it, so it's really not a choice for clubs to participate or not. It's just an automatic calculation by the system. So any course in the world, as long as they have 8 scores, could potentially have a PCC calculation that day. So good questions, and we'll move on and go forward. We will stop a couple more times for questions just if they continue to come in. So with the PCC, we've been told, and based on the data that we've seen down in areas that have been posting year-round, it'll happen in about 15 to 25% of eligible days. That means if the course is rated 100% perfect by the local association, PCC will still happen because course and weather conditions can cause outlier scores. It will be conservative in nature, meaning it's not a one-to-one calculation. So if every single player on a course and there's 100 people that go out and play and everyone shoots 15 shots over their target score on that day, the adjustment will not be 15. So it's not a one-to-one calculation. It's just simply meant to bring those outlier days closer to the mean. So adjustments could range from -1 when the course is playing easier, all the way up to +3 when it's more difficult. So in that example, if 15 people were, or if every player was 15 shots over their target score, the most an adjustment could be is +3 when it's playing more difficult. And it'll always be in integer values, so you'll never see a 2.62 or a -0.8. It'll always be -1 if it's easier, 0 if there's no adjustment, or +1, +2, or +3 if the course is playing more difficult that day. So a couple of examples from 2020 that have already happened. The image on the left, the chart on the left, is from Coral Ridge Country Club, which is down in the Fort Lauderdale area in Florida. And you can see here, every single adjusted gross score was above the target score. Not one player played to their target score. And there were some players that played significantly over their target score. There was a one handicap player that with a target score of 73 that shot 89 that day. So that was 16 shots over their target score. So clearly a difficult day. And this had the most severe adjustment of +3 to PCC. We did look at weather just out of curiosity. It was 66 overcast with 8 to 10 mile an hour winds in Fort Lauderdale that day. So not extremely difficult weather conditions. So it's probably related to course setup that caused everyone to shoot much above their target score that day. The one on the right was from DuPont Country Club down in Delaware. I believe this was from the Nemours course there. And there were 12 scores here that were considered. And there were 2 people that shot their target score and 2 individuals that were shot less than their target score. So again, target score only happens about 1 in 5 times. Shooting under target score is even more rare than that. So in this case, since there were so many people playing well, either at their target score, below their target score, just 1 or 2 above, the course was playing significantly easier that day, and that had the most severe adjustment in the other direction, -1. So again, just a couple of examples from the real world on how PCC is applied and how those charts look. So naturally, this thought got us thinking. I'm a data nerd. I love knowing what goes into a formula and how everything works. What is the formula? And it was one of the first questions we asked at the USGA when we were getting trained on this last year. Unfortunately, the answer is it's a proprietary formula. It won't be shared, so we can't see exactly what goes into it. But doing a little bit of testing, we did some tests with some hypothetical golfers on hypothetical courses. We found that there are 2 main factors driving the calculation. They both make sense. The first is the average of shots above or below the target score. So if you have 100 players that play a course and on average they're 8 above their target score, that's pretty severe, and that's the first main factor. The other main factor is the number of players shooting their target score. So even if that average is high, if there's a lot of players that are playing well, you can look at those other players as outliers that are just playing poorly and not necessarily due to the course. So we looked at a couple situations where there were only 8 scores posted. The first was all 8 players shot exactly 5 shots over their target score. So every single person on this chart, 5 over their target score. In that case, the PCC adjustment was +2. Again, showcasing it's not a 1-to-1 adjustment. Here, everyone was 5 over their target score, but the adjustment was +2. The second chart shows that average above the target score stayed the same. So the average of players above their target score was 5 shots, but in this circumstance, half the field shot their target score and half the field were 10 over. So the average was still 5 over, but because so many players shot their target score, on this day there was no PCC adjustment. So you can see those are the 2 main factors. The most important thing that you guys can do to ensure that PCC is done correctly is simply post the score on the day of play. Obviously, the more data that a course has on a given day, the better. But these were just a couple main factors that come into play with the calculation for PCC. So unfortunately, we won't know the formula, but these were a little common sense, but 2 of the main things that drive that formula. And then we will stop again for more questions. I see a couple came through.
Oh yeah, they're flowing now, Steve. So first one here, will it apply to just one course or all the courses in the area if the weather is bad?
So again, it's not something that's weather related. So each course will be treated uniquely. It's possible, and you can even look at a course like, we'll use Wilmington down in Delaware as an example that has a north and south course. And let's say the weather's obviously exactly the same at that facility, but one course might have prepared for it and moved some tees up or made the whole location easier. And that hedged the weather a little bit where players played more in line with what they were expected to play, where the other course didn't do any of those natures and the scores were higher. So it's a course by course calculation and it's not weather related. As you guys know, in some cases, if the wind's blowing at 20 miles an hour, but blowing in the right direction, that could be beneficial, where the long par 4s are downwind to make it easier, and the shorter par 5s are into the wind, which isn't really a big deal. So it's not always weather related. It's more just looking at projected scores and seeing what the actual scores are and comparing those, and having the system do an automatic calculation.
All right. How do public courses match up when public golfers may post outside a club, say at home?
So as long as the scores, if I'm understanding the question correctly, as long as the score is posted on the day that they play, even if it's not at the facility, if they do it on their app or their computer at home, as long as it comes through on that day, it will be considered for the PCC calculation.
And I know we've had a few questions about this, so I'll follow up with this one. What if you don't post your score by midnight of that day?
So we have a slide coming in the next couple slides. You will get the calculated PCC adjustment, but the adjustment is the calculation only occurs once. It's midnight on that day, so it won't be recalculated if more scores come in later, but you will get whatever that calculation was.
Gotcha. Can I see what the adjustment was, or for a day was used?
Yes, that's actually the very next slide, so great question. We'll get to that on the next slide.
All right, a couple more here. Does a +1 mean the course rating is raised by 1, which provides a lower differential?
All the good questions are coming in. You guys are psychics. The next slide will also address that.
All right, 2 more here before we move on. So the adjustment is based on how everyone plays that day, not how I play that day. It seems like it from what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah, it's there could be a situation where the PCC adjustment is +3, meaning it's the most severe and the course is playing difficult. If you played your career around that day, and the other people on the course still played difficult or played poorly and triggered that +3 adjustment, then yes, you would still get the adjustment. So it includes everyone, not just yourself.
Mm-hmm. And what happens in tournaments? Does PCC apply to net tournament scores, and how can that be done since it is at midnight?
So it won't be applied in net tournament scores. It's just based on the differential in the player's record. So the tournament, because everyone is essentially playing the same course that day, doing it in a tournament would deduct or increase everyone by the same amount. So it would come up with the same result.
All right, Steve, I got one more question here for you before we move on. What if the data is different based on the tee from which you play, i.e. all blue tee scores are at target score and all white tee scores are over?
Yeah, we're not sure about that. I believe everything's just looked at assuming that it's from the same course. So again, we don't know the formula, but I would think that each of those tees would be treated the same as a part of the course, but we don't know for sure the answer to that.
All right, perfect. Well, we're going to move on. If you guys do have questions, keep them coming. We will stop at the next break.
Yep, great question so far. So how will PCC look on your scoring record? So we took a look at one of our players that we knew played a lot in Florida, and you can see now on your handicap record, whether this is on GYN.com, GYN mobile app, on the Gap Locker, there will be now a column for PCC. So if no PCC adjustment occurs on a day, it'll just have a line for being blank. But if there is an adjustment, it'll show what it is in that column. So PCC comes into the score differential calculation before it's essentially changing the adjusted gross score. So you take the adjusted gross score and then you subtract PCC. So again, if PCC is, if the course is playing more difficult, PCC will be a positive number. So it would be like the adjusted gross score goes down. And if it's a -1, you would essentially add a stroke to the adjusted gross score. So looking at how this works, in 2019, it was the same formula, but that minus PCC component wasn't there. So the adjusted gross score was 80. You subtracted the course rating of 71.2, multiplied by 113, and then divided by the slope of the tee at 131. That was a 7.6 differential. In the World Handicap System method in 2020, adjusted gross score is 80, but now we have that PCC of +1, so you subtract +1. So essentially, the score's being treated like it is a 79. So that 80 minus 1, which is 79, subtract the course rating of 71.2, multiplied by 113, which is a constant for average course difficulty, and then divided by 131. In this case, the differential is 6.7. So you'll see in situations where the slope rating is greater than 113 and the course is relatively difficult, the impact on the differential will be a little less than 1 or 2. In this case, it was 0.9. because it is like the adjusted gross score is getting adjusted, not the differential. In situations where the course, the T-slope is below 113, that differential might be greater. The impact on differential might be a little bit greater than 1. So that's how PCC will look on the scoring record. And we did have a question on the time frame of score posting and how that's extremely important in the New World handicap system, not only for daily revisions where your handicap will update on the next day, but also with PCC. So we'll take a look at an example of 100 players playing golf on Monday, July 1st, and this is just a hypothetical example. Just 75 of those players post on 7/1 before midnight. So 75 of the 100 play that day, post their score, date it on July 1st, and they're in the system. The calculation only happens once, so it's on midnight of 7/1 with just those 75 players included in the calculation. And here the adjustment is +1. So obviously everyone in Group A gets that adjustment of +1 to their record. A couple days later, on July 3rd, 20 players, which we'll call Group B, they post their round from 7/1. So they posted on the 3rd, but the date for that round is 7/1 on that specific course. So they receive the calculated PCC, but since that PCC is only calculated once, it isn't recalculated. So they get the +1, but there's not a recalculation. Same thing happens with the remaining 5 players on Friday the 5th. They post their round, again, dated 7/1, and they post it on Friday, and they also receive that calculated PCC of +1. So the point of this slide here is it's important to show that posting late could impact all 100 players. Let's say that players in B and C didn't post their score right away because they were really poor scores and they didn't want that on their record for whatever reason right away. If they would have posted that score on Monday the 1st, maybe the PCC calculation would have been +2 or +3 instead of +1. We all know playing in net events that one stroke can mean a huge difference, whether it comes down to one stroke in match play or a player winning by one stroke in a stroke play net competition. So those calculations potentially affecting 100 players that day could have a ripple effect of it affecting the handicap index by 0.1 or 0.2, which affects the course handicap by 1, could have a ripple effect in determining club events and other events that are played. So again, not only is time frame important for posting for daily revisions, but it could impact every single player that plays a course on a given day. So I believe those 2 slides answered a couple questions we had. And before we go into our last couple slides, wanted to stop one more time for questions.
Just one so far. What if someone were playing in a morning tournament where all balls must be holed and others are playing in the afternoon and not in a tournament where there would be gimmies?
Yeah, so that would, both those scores would be weighted the same way. Theoretically, with gimmies, you're still using the most acceptable score. So the scores should be pretty similar, give or take. So both those scores are treated the same way.
All right, looks like we're light on questions for this section. If you do have questions, please feel free to submit them. We will have one more portion at the end.
All right. So a couple things kind of looking into the future of how we can use PCC to better do our jobs. So again, despite being conservative in nature, PCC will still occur on 15 to 25% of all rounds. Even if a course is rated perfectly, there will still be days where the weather or course conditions cause scores to deviate from the mean. So, but if there's a course that we keep seeing that pops up on a PCC report that has PCC occurring on 40 or 50% of their rounds, something's clearly wrong in these situations, and it gives us an opportunity to revisit the rating and see what's going on. So in some cases, we may need to remeasure or re-rate the golf course. Maybe there were some significant changes on the course that changed how it plays, or there was assumptions that were made in the most recent rating that affect how the rating ended up being. That's one potential reason for us to come out, but probably the more likely one is to discuss how the course is being set up for daily play. And that's where the image on the right comes into play. So let's say when Gap was out rating the course, we were told that the tee was being played from, the red tee was being played from inside that red circle on the chart. So we measured and rated from that tee. But over time, whether it was a couple years down the road or sometime later that year, and the members were saying, hey, this tee's too far back, we need it up a box, and then the tee ended up getting played on the blue box, where it's probably a 30 or 40 yard difference, that can significantly impact how the hole's played and how the course is played. And if that happens on a couple holes, could make all the difference in explaining why PCC is occurring more than usual. So either way, this is a good reason for GAP to be able to use data to make sure that the course ratings that we have are accurate. This was, in the old system, there was no really way to validate the course ratings, and this is just another data point for us to make sure that a course isn't too far out of whack. But again, across the world, if the USGA and other governing bodies see that a certain type of course continues to have PCC, whether it's an ocean course or one that's extremely short or one that's long, they can use this data to maybe tweak the course rating formula. Maybe for those of you that came on our webinar last Wednesday regarding course rating, yardage right now is about 93 to 95%. I don't know the exact number of a course rating, but with this data in PCC, if we see shorter courses or longer courses continue to show up on a list, maybe they retweak some of those data points in the formula to better enhance that formula. So again, this is seen as a good thing. The more data we have, the more we're able to use it to better the experience for players and all those net competitions. Kind of along those same lines is, do you guys foresee a circumstance in which we use score data to rate courses instead of the rating process? So I want to emphasize the course rating system will still be the most important factor. As we talked about on that target score slide, that's really the basis for expected score, is using the course rating and slope to come up with the course handicap. So that's always going to remain important. So if you consider a day when 10 scores are posted and everyone shot their target score, what are some factors that could contribute to the players shooting their target score? On one side, you have the PCC argument, where course or weather conditions made scoring easier that day. So a couple tees were moved up, the weather was perfect, things like that, where it's just easy to shoot a good round that day. The other two factors are kind of outside of the rating procedure. So one, players playing well that day. A player's going to shoot their target score about 20% of the time, and those 10 players that day could just have a good day all in that 20% where they shoot a good round. So that had nothing to do with the course playing easier or more difficult. It was just you're going to shoot your target score 1 in 5 times, and it just all happened to be on the same day. The other one, kind of going along with one of those last questions we had, is maybe there were generous or the opposite of generous most acceptable score guidelines. So maybe there were 8-foot gimmies that made scores go down, or some holes were not finished due to darkness or a match ending, and on those scores it was net par and they weren't getting a stroke, so they were just taking par on that hole instead of bogey. So a couple factors there with most acceptable score where you're still using the rules of handicapping but kind of tilted one way or another. Those are kind of outside the range of what we can predict. So we're kind of balancing that, and the course rating system and the course rating and slope that GAP calculates, that's the easiest way to standardize the process with having the most objective system possible. As we bring in score data, a little bit of subjectivity comes into play there, and we want to try to avoid that if at all possible. So that's why the course rating system will remain. We won't use score data to rate courses, but obviously as we see this and go through the next couple of years, we can see how we can use score data to better enhance the rating process. But also kind of along those same lines, looking at PCC in the active season, we've been asked, now that PCC is adjusting scores, can we make the active season a little bit longer? So GAP still controls the window for acceptable score posting. We've collaborated with some of the other local associations in the area, like the New Jersey State Golf Association and the Delaware State Golf Association, where we all have that same posting frame. So if a player is traveling 20 miles, they're going to be posting the same window. Right now, it's April 1st to November 14th, and that's always something we're looking at. Just a couple of years ago, we realized the weather in the fall is typically better and better, so we extended it 2 weeks from November 1st to November 14th. So when we rate a golf course, we consider the season to be when there's peak conditions, so that we take into account the fairway height, the rough length, the green speed, and how those, and the further away we get from active season, the more those conditions are going to change and make it harder to use that formula to predict scores coming in. So some factors to consider as we get further away from active season and into December and January here in the Northeast. So trees are thinning out, making it less likely that a ball is going to get hit by a tree and easier for it to be played out of. There's areas of course that are no longer maintained, so this might make it more difficult to play out of a certain location. Green and rough length change in either direction in the off season, and sometimes tee markers are moved around to allow certain boxes to heal again, which drastically impacts yardage. And then the picture on the right, you can see this might be a day where it's 50 degrees and snowed a couple days ago, and there's big spots of snow on the ground. people still might be playing golf that day, but it's clearly not a normal golfing experience. So like we said early on, PCC is not a one-to-one adjustment. So if 8 players go out and play over their target by 5 shots, the adjustment's only +2. And those players playing 5 over, them playing 5 over their target score might be 100% due to the way the course is playing that day. If the rough length is extremely long or the green speeds are much different and the course is just that much more difficult, the adjustment's only +2. So it brings it down. But if we're using that adjustment, the adjustment is not going to be enough the further away we get from the active posting season. So for the time being, we're not planning on changing the active season, but it's something that we always look at. Like I mentioned, we did change the season a couple of years ago. We're always going to look at it. We want to provide golfers with as many opportunities to play and post a round of golf, but within reason. PCC is great to do during the season because it'll bring scores closer to the mean, but it can't be used as the standard going forward because it's not that one-to-one adjustment and it might not describe all the difficulty or the ease that's going into the course on a given day. So that's all the slides we had. I did see some more questions start to come through. Thanks again for joining, and we will stay on the line a couple more minutes to answer some of these that have come through.
Awesome, Steve. Thanks so much. That was a great presentation. Just a quick note for everyone before we get into these questions. We are going to answer any questions that we don't get to verbally. We're going to follow up with you guys after the fact. And if you do have any questions that didn't get answered or something that pops in your mind a little bit later, always feel free to reach out to anyone on our member services staff. They're very knowledgeable and able to answer your questions. So first one we got here for you, Steve, is will the clubs be required to collect and post tournament scores so the whole field is posted at once on the correct day?
Yes, we've been strongly encouraging to do that for clubs. With USGA tournament management being the tournament software in the GAP region, when there is a tournament at a club, the club has the ability, once they enter those scores into the system, to determine the result for the event, to post scores with the click of a button. So we're going to rely on clubs to make sure they're continuing to follow that process and making that a part of their checklist post round to make sure the scores are posted. So yes, that's very important and something that we anticipate happening.
Another one here. So the easy way to instruct members without getting into the math would be that a +1 represents your score is calculated as 1 shot better versus -1 represents 1 stroke worse.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, if the adjustment's +1 and the score your score that day was 80, it's being treated as if you shot 79 that day. If the adjustment's -1, it's being treated as if you shot 81 that day. So yes, that's correct.
Gotcha. Another one here. So 50% PCC, re-rate the course from 73 to 75, and then the handicaps go from 5 to 3, for example. And then the expected score the same, and you still will have a PCC for those days?
So the rating adjustment, again, we're not really anticipating that happening, but it will be a good touch point if we see a course has a PCC that happens 50% of the time. That's a situation that we're not anticipating happening a lot. But what that'll happen is it'll require an immediate trip or conversation out to the course. And when we do re-rate the course, that'll typically be a little bit of a longer process just to make sure we're going through all our checks and balances. So it will eventually get phased out, but it won't be kind of an immediate thing. We would re-rate the course and probably at the end of the season or sometime a couple weeks later apply that new rating. And eventually there would be that 2-stroke difference right away, but that would start to get phased out the more players play golf. So again, that's not an ideal situation any way you cut it, but in the past there would have been no way for us to know that, and it would have been 2 strokes off in perpetuity, which could be as long as 5 or 6 years. Now we will be able to address that right away, and while it won't be an instantaneous correction, it'll help us kind of phase it out quicker.
All right, a couple more here. If a course is aerated, does that factor into PCC?
Not directly. It still goes back into that expected scores versus target scores. So you would think if a course is aerated, the scores might typically be a little bit higher, but the course could compensate and move some tee boxes up, things like that. Mm-hmm. So it'll still go back into expected scores versus actual scores. And if the aeration is clearly causing scores to be higher, then yes, PCC will be applied.
Perfect. Well, Steve, it looks like that's the end of our question list here. Again, if you guys have any follow-up questions, comments, anything, feel free to reach out to us personally. All of our information, email addresses, and phone numbers are listed on gapgolf.org. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today for the player conditions calculations webinar. Hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you at the next one.